everything old is new again, literally. So that I think people are going back to try to make more classic jambalayas, whatever they may decide. And I usually say that one must be to the jambalaya born as much as I like to say people must be to the gumbo born, because everybody's grandma made a different one. So you can pretty much put anything on the table within reasons and restrictions. If it's got rice and some chicken and some sausage and the rice is some kind of hue and you're cooking it a certain kind of way, that may be the definer. One of the things that I tend to say, particularly about the food of the African diaspora, is because we have never really codified it in the same way as La Rousse Gastronomique or the texts to which you were referring, people tend to find a degree of elasticity in what they can call things. But there are still techniques, traditions, and ingredients that obtain.
So it's showing us, and it's a word we've used a lot today, showing respect to the original while still using your own creativity.
It's all about Aretha.
Yep. And from my point of view, I thought I was being terribly clever when I created the batter for my fish and chips when I was doing a recipe and I put turmeric in it, which is a great thing to use if you're making pastry or if you're using batters, because it gives it a tiny bit, gives it a beautiful golden color. And I'd changed the world, obviously, until someone pointed out that it was in a recipe book from 1890.
Right.
And I hadn't really changed. I hadn't changed anything at all. I know that we are ready to have some questions, and you should really take the opportunity to ask something of these. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to throw this idea out that I just came back from the south of France, and we were in the Camargue. We were picking rice. It had been harvested, but there was some rice on there. And all I could think of when I was doing this was a lot of slaves came to the Camargue and were picking the rice. And actually also Vietnamese in the 40s. But also immigrants would come, pick the rice, and leave to go to their other countries. So then they would want to plant those seeds. And that's really how food traveled. And this red rice, I was speaking to, I don't know if David Shields was here, but Glenn Roberts was telling me that a lot of the Protestants and also the blacks and the Jews that were kind of outsiders in France would eat the red rice. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but they said that again in the Camargue, which was really interesting.
That they have these connections.
Yeah, and that rice is something, you're absolutely right, that, when was rice added to Charlotte? Well, it was added pretty early because Dafina, which was Moroccan, and that came clearly from Spain, they had the rice in there. But it's the red rice that, to me, is the most intriguing.
That's a David Shields question.
What?
I said that's a David Shields question. Absolutely.
Let's take some questions, because I know, as I said, you should definitely take the opportunity to ask these two extraordinary historians about these dishes and anything else you might want to ask them.
I think it's four.
Well, thank you again for those wonderful stories and your commentary. I'm kind of breathless as I'm listening to you talk about these dishes, and the response on Twitter is also very lively. So I want to bring that into the discussion. So we've talked about the importance of oral tradition, and really that's the importance of apprenticeship, being in the kitchen, observing a master chef or cook prepare ingredients, using their senses. We're observing that through apprenticeship. So as two cookbook authors who try to translate that almost intangible experience onto the page, what do we lose in translating food traditions into a recipe in print? And what do we gain? What are the opportunities there as well?
I
Please.
can answer. Well, for me, what I really like to do, it's one of the most important things for me, is to watch authentic cooks cooking whatever they're cooking. And it doesn't mean that you have to do it identically, but I think that it's a way of capturing oral history, and if we don't capture it now, it's gone. That's the first thing. I also think it's like a diagram for people, and you can go off the diagram, or you can veer away from it, but at least you have it. And I think it's really, really important to capture these food traditions, because what will the next generation have if they don't have the traditions? Because everything's going so quickly.
I would agree with that, but I would also, before I take it back, I'll add some more to it. I think the hardest thing in the world for me to do is write recipe, because I really don't believe in recipe. Okay? I think that you learn. I think that you intuit. I think certainly in this day and age and in the era of YouTube, recipe may be visual more than written. We tend here to write in terms of cups and teaspoons and tablespoons. Let's talk about that measure and what happens when you line up 4 different people's tablespoons. Okay? But we treat this as though it is an architectural diagram, that if you move this way, it will crumble.
So it's a
That's
guidance,
not-
but my question there is, sorry,
That's not, we take recipe as the tablets coming down from the mountain.
Not necessarily.
Most people who use them,
I think there is definitely a
them that
danger
way.
with that. The other side I would say to that is, if you have someone with your knowledge of a recipe, it would almost seem to me unfair not to share that with as many people as possible. And the recipe book, or recipes in one form or another, is the only way you can do that. Because otherwise, you can only give, kind of oral advice to someone, to very few people, and because of your schedule and everything else. So recipes have a value there, but I think the importance of a recipe as being the tablet in stone, I think, is a very, very good way of putting it. I think it's dangerous. And when people say to me about, well, what's the recipe? And I've only got this, can I use this? And I go, try it.
exactly.
Try
I mean,
it.
or people will say, this recipe doesn't work. It's like, really?
Well,
I mean, because I think I'm assuming that most of us here cook and know something about it. If you look at the early recipes, they didn't go through all of that. Take this and move that and add this and then put your 3 drops in. Now let it, they didn't do that. They made assumptions.
Yes, and that
About-
intuition that we talked about earlier.
The wisdom of the cook and about the ability of the cook.
but these people aren't in the kitchen all the time here today.
I know. That's why I'm saying what I'm saying, because I think that then becomes a guide, but we look at these things as though they are the mouth of God.
But I think you have to give someone a starting point, and that's my view.
Oh,
with
y'all
any
are more
recipe.
generous than I am.
But I also, but I also think what you're saying about writing the recipe, that's a really hard process. I watch these women, mostly women, but a lot of men too, in the kitchen, and then what I try to do, I write very quickly on the computer. And so I go home, I look at my notes that I've written, and I try to write up a recipe. Then I'll test it. And then I'll go back to the recipe and change it to see, well, wait a minute, we're busy. How can we do this in steps so that you can have a life? And how can you do, so it's not exactly what I've seen, but I think it's pretty close to it to make people understand that they can do it, even if they go, I mean, I always deviate from recipe if I don't have whatever ingredient. They can do that, but at least they know they've got a place to start. And I think that's our role. Look at, and it's not going to be perfect.
And I think recipes have changed over the years, as we've talked about, and going back as far as Mrs. Beaton, and first catch your rabbit, where we've gone past that stage. So I think recipes will continue to change, and now there are 30-second aerial pictures of someone throwing stuff in pots, which just astounds me when they try and do a slow cook dish and they just have a picture of a crock pot from above and they do it in 30 seconds, and I'm like, oh. Did we have...
We have many, many more questions, so I'll see if I can fit in a few more. We have one that just came in from the audience that really piqued my interests. And this actually comes from a chef who's thinking about the elasticity of recipes like jambalaya, for example, and bringing in the conversation of appropriation, a very hot topic in the chef community world today. How can a chef or a cook or a home cook interpret dishes in a responsible way and riff on them and add fusions? How can they do this in a responsible way, keeping in mind issues of appropriation?
Well, do you mean that they're writing about that recipe or saying it's their own recipe? I mean...
I cannot speak for the chef in the audience who asked this, but I think it's the idea that there's a demand from American audiences today for new foods, for fusion foods, for revisiting traditional foods. And so chefs attempt to bring that into their restaurants to meet that demand. But how do they do so in a way, if that's not necessarily an ancestral heritage, how do they do that responsibly?
I think that they are going to appropriate. That's just the way it goes, unfortunately, today. It's not nice. It would be nice for them to acknowledge who they got the recipe from. You have to change just 2 ingredients or 2, like a teaspoon versus a half a teaspoon, and it's yours. So there's no copyright that you can really get from that. But I always feel, if you've done a recipe that's a good recipe, it's something that's come before and it will live after you. And that's part of the game.
I think the worry you can have with a view of appropriation, and I understand why it's an important issue, is getting to that point where you go, only people from a culture can cook food from that culture. And I think that's a very dangerous place to get into.
It's a slippery slope indeed in a
Because,
museum where we're talking about Julia Child's kitchen.
And
Okay.
we had great conversations earlier about African American chefs. And I got interested there where people say, well, they're classically trained. And they're going, no, they're just trained. Classically trained means something to me. It means they're forced into necessarily a pigeonhole of French. To me, I would say, no, they're trained, they're good, they're skillful, they can go off in lots of different directions. And I personally don't think it has anything to do with an accident of birth. It has to do with exposure to the cuisine. It has to do with talent. It has to do with mentorship. It has to do with being any good. And I give the example where I got really angry with someone who wrote in a book, in an article or something in LA, and they said, well, if whenever I go into a sushi restaurant and I see Mexicans behind the counter, I walk out. I go, well, you're an idiot. You're a moron. They're either good or they're not good.
Right.
And that's the truth of any chef. I get angry about this, so I'm getting riled. You're either good or you're not good. But you have to show respect for the culture. You have to seek out the correct sources for the culture. You have to dedicate the time to expose yourself to that culture so you understand it. And we mentioned Rick Bayless earlier. Rick Bayless is a great example of someone who's done all of that and has every right to stand up as a cook of Mexican food because he's done his due diligence. And so I think we have to just be, while I totally understand that notion of respect for the food, I think you have to be very, very careful about drawing lines that only certain people, which people are saying, can only cook food from a certain culture. And now you can
The fingers up again. A couple of things. One, there are cultures of power and there are cultures with lack of power. It is thank you. It is very, very difficult. It is very, very demeaning. It is very, very problematic when people from cultures of power appropriate. With all due admiration, cultures of people without power. When people don't have the power to manifest, to make their things right, clear and claimed, it's sort of like everybody's grab. When there are an equal or proportionate number of restaurants considered white tablecloth restaurants, considered fancy fine dining restaurants, of the cultures of people without power, then appropriate away. But until that time, be mindful, be respectful, and on occasion, back off.
And and I totally agree with that, but how would you know,
Right.
how would you know when to without those, so what it's about in the end
Ask
is
somebody.
dialogue. It's dialogue.
Ask
Yeah,
somebody.
it's dialogue.
But we,
Ask
And that's
somebody.
where mentorship comes in.
Ask somebody.
well, you know, what you're saying, I think of all these restaurants in Washington where the non-powerful populations are making the, all the finger food. They're making the tortillas, they're making the whatever, the breads. You know, that's one thing, but what you're saying is a little bit different. And I think that we're trying to respect the little people in the kitchen, in the restaurants.
But see, you're
where
already
they-
calling them little people.
Well, you know, the ones that are not getting lots of money.
It
the-
is so much. Thank you, but it's also
Well, they're getting more money than they had.
it's a twisted, slippery slope. And to attempt to define it in a 5-minute panel
Oh, yeah.
is not a good idea.
Okay.
Okay, so we probably
Let's
need
move
to
on.
move on.
Why don't we move on to another question, if we have time for one? This will be something we can discuss even more later.
It requires alcohol.
Yes.
Let's do it.
Most things do.
So to wrap up, we'll ask one more question from the audience, and I want to bring this back to the idea of tradition. Why is it so important to share these historic recipes? Why do we need to pass this knowledge on to the next generation?
I'd like to take that. There is a Ghanaian symbol called Sankofa, and it is mirrored, if you will, in Roman tradition by Janus. It looks back to look forward. If you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going. Tradition.
And I also think that, I mean, it's well said, but it seems to me in the Jewish tradition that not only these recipes, but the whole cycle of the week, of the day, of the month, the hymns, the songs, the prayers, it all is part of who you are. And for many people, food is the last thing to go in a culture. And I don't want my kids or my grandkids, of which I will have 2 on Monday, for my first 2,
Bravo.
I don't want them to have a rootless life where there's no traditions. Like, he has this fish and chips that's very much part of him. And I think these recipes are really important to say who you are within a culture.
And from my point of view, I absolutely applaud both of those answers. I think they make tremendous sense. For me, it's more personal. By trying to explain to someone, as I've tried to explain to you, why that dish is important, it kind of helps me understand who I am. And I'm part Bengali, part Welsh, an American citizen. But by talking about that dish, I understand that what I really am at heart is British, and will always be British, whatever the accidents of my moving around the world. And so for me, trying to explain it helps me. So it's a very selfish reason, but there it is.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your personal stories and your rich research. This has been
That was
such a
fun.
treat. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'll kick this back to Lauren.
It was a wonderful panel. Thank you all three for being people of the word, which is a new phrase, a new favorite phrase. Okay, so these have all been incredible. Hold up, there's so much information, there's so much more. So, but we've really just scratched the surface, of course, we've only gotten started. So in grand Smithsonian Food History Weekend tradition, let's keep the conversation going. Many different ways to do that. So all three panelists here will be outside signing their books immediately following this panel. And then for those of you that have registered in advance, the happy hour also starts now. And as was mentioned, drinking could help these conversations, so let's get going. Yeah, that is in the S.C. Johnson Conference Center, which is on the west wing of this building. It's straight across the museum that way. Once you leave, you go all the way around. And look for staff. They will help you find it. We will be checking IDs at happy hour. You have to be over 21 to get in. That's the way it goes. So if you weren't able to register for happy hour, which is full now, and looking for some fun dinner plans, don't miss the participating dine-out restaurants. They're on page 14 and 15 of your weekend guide. And they're featuring a drink or dish that will support future programs here. Tomorrow is another full day of programming at the National Museum of American History. All day from 10 a.m. to 5:30, there's hands-on learning, live demonstrations, talks, and stories exploring the past, present, and future of food and community in America. So check out the full schedule on page 17, and please come back and join us tomorrow for all the fun. So thank you, everyone, for coming today. Let's thank all of our roundtable participants. They were wonderful. And have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for coming.